The first thing you notice underground is that sound dies differently. Not silence, silence is something you choose. Underground, sound is taken from you. The hum of traffic, the argument 2 floors above, the neighbor's television bleeding through thin walls, all of it vanishes the moment the earth closes over your head. What's left is only your breathing, only your heartbeat, only the scrape of your knees against limestone that hasn't seen light since before your grandmother was born. Maya Osei was 31 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and 96 pounds lighter than she'd been 2 years ago. Not from discipline. Not from a wellness plan. From grief. She was lying flat on her stomach in a crack in the earth 12 miles outside a small Tennessee town called Belhaven, and the crack was exactly 17 inches wide at its narrowest point. She'd measured it with her forearm. The ceiling pressed against her shoulder blades. The floor scraped her chin. She should have turned back. Every reasonable voice inside her said turn back. But here's the thing about people who have already lost everything, they have a complicated relationship with the word reasonable. So she pressed her palms flat against the cold stone. She exhaled until her ribs contracted. And she moved forward. 2 years before that crawlspace, Maya Osei had what most people would call a life worth protecting. She taught geology at a small university in Nashville, not a glamorous position, not well-paying, but hers. She had a daughter named Iris who was 8 years old and obsessed with dinosaurs and the color orange. She had a husband named Daniel who made terrible coffee and excellent pancakes and laughed too loudly at his own jokes. She had a house with a porch that needed repainting and a backyard with one stubborn oak tree that dropped acorns every autumn like it was personally trying to annoy her. She had all of it, and then she had none of it. The accident happened on a Tuesday, which Maya has always found cruelly ordinary. Tuesdays shouldn't be allowed to hold catastrophic events. Tuesdays should be reserved for forgotten dentist appointments and mediocre lunches. Not this. Not a pickup truck running a red light at 40 miles an hour into the passenger side of a sedan. Daniel died at the scene. Iris died 3 days later, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and someone else's flowers. Maya was not in the car. She had stayed late at the university to grade papers. She had kissed them both goodbye that morning, a quick, distracted kiss, the kind you give when you assume there will be thousands more. The kind you give when you haven't yet learned that some kisses are final. The grief counselor used words like processing, and stages, and timeline. Maya sat in the chair across from her and understood that the woman meant well and understood, also, that none of these words touched what was actually happening inside her chest. What was happening was not a process. It was an erasure. She stopped teaching. The university gave her a semester's leave, then another, then quietly suggested she consider her options. She moved out of the house with the porch and the stubborn oak, couldn't bear the acorns in autumn, couldn't bear any of it. She rented a one-room apartment above a laundromat in a part of Nashville she didn't know, which felt intentional. An anonymous place for a person who was becoming anonymous to herself. She barely ate. Slept too much, then not at all. Stopped reading the books she'd always loved. Stopped calling her sister in Atlanta, who called her instead, 3 times a week, leaving voicemails that Maya listened to in full but never answered. The thing about catastrophic grief, the kind that takes not just a person but an entire life, an entire architecture of daily meaning, is that it doesn't feel like sadness. Sadness implies feeling. What Maya experienced was closer to subtraction. As if something had reached inside her and removed not just Daniel and Iris but the Maya who had loved them. The Maya who made lesson plans and argued about pancake recipes and yelled at football games and sang badly in the shower. Gone. All of it, gone. What remained was just a body. Breathing. Occupying space. Waiting for some unnamed thing with no particular urgency. She had always been a caver. Not professionally, it had been a hobby she'd picked up in graduate school, tagging along with a friend who studied karst geology. She'd loved it immediately, the way geology stopped being theoretical underground. Down there, time was written in stone. You could touch a formation that took 10,000 years to grow a single inch, and the scale of that, the humbling, beautiful scale of deep time, had always steadied her. Made her own problems feel appropriately small. She hadn't caved since Iris was born. Too dangerous, Daniel had said, only half joking. And she'd agreed, because suddenly she had so much to lose. Now, 18 months after the accident, she had nothing left to lose. She found her old gear in a storage unit she'd been paying for without thinking about. Headlamp. Harness. Knee pads. A worn guidebook to Tennessee cave systems that she'd annotated in graduate school in handwriting she almost didn't recognize as her own. She opened the guidebook and stared at her old notes for a long time. Then she drove to Belhaven. She hadn't planned to go to that specific crack. She'd planned to visit Hollowtree Cave, a well-documented system 2 miles north, tourist-friendly passages, a few sporting sections, nothing that would kill a solo caver with rusty skills. A reintroduction. A test of whether she still wanted to be underground at all, or whether that version of herself had been erased too. But Hollowtree's access gate was padlocked. New signage. Something about a permit system implemented after a rescue operation the previous spring. She stood at the gate for a while, pack on her back, and felt the specific flatness of a person who had expected to feel something and had been denied even that. She drove back along the access road slowly. The Tennessee hills in October were burning gold and rust, the kind of beauty that feels almost aggressive when you're in pain. She pulled over at a gravel turnout to look at the map on her phone, and that's when she saw the old man. He was sitting on a folding chair outside a farmhouse set back from the road, watching her with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere to be and never did. 70s, maybe. Weather-beaten face. A John Deere cap that had seen better decades. Hollowtree's closed, he said, without her asking. I know, she said. You're a caver. Not a question. He was looking at her pack. Used to be. He tilted his head. Studied her for a moment with those unhurried eyes. Then he pointed, not toward the road but toward the hillside behind his property, where the tree line broke against a limestone face. There's a crack back there, he said. Been there long as I've owned this land. Long before that, I expect. My wife used to call it the Needle's Eye. He paused. She was a caver too, in her day. Maya looked at the hillside. Anyone surveyed it? Not that I know of. Goes back maybe 20, 30 feet, I always assumed. My wife crawled in partway, 20 years ago. Said it got too tight and she came back. He looked at Maya with something careful in his expression. She was smaller than you. Maya felt a strange thing happen then, a small, specific flicker of something she hadn't felt in 18 months. Not happiness. Not hope, exactly. But curiosity. The edge of a question. She looked at the hillside. Would you mind if I'll make coffee, the old man said. Come back and tell me what you find. The crack was exactly where he'd pointed, a vertical fracture in the limestone face, maybe 20 feet high at the opening but narrowing aggressively. The opening itself was manageable. 2 feet wide, roughly. But 6 feet in, it compressed to something that made Maya's chest tighten just looking at it. 17 inches. She pressed her forearm across the gap. 17 inches. She had made it through tighter passages in her caving years, but not recently. Not alone. Not without someone who knew where she was, except for an old man she'd met 10 minutes ago on a roadside in a county she'd never visited before. She sat outside the crack for a long time. This was, objectively, not a reasonable thing to do. Solo caving in an unsurveyed system, no trip plan filed, aging gear, body she'd spent 18 months neglecting. She could get stuck. She could get hurt. The limestone could shift, unlikely, but possible. She could simply run out of psychological capacity halfway in and find herself frozen in a tube of rock with no one coming. She knew all of this. She also knew that she had driven 2 hours to feel something, and standing at the gate of a padlocked cave in the gold October light, she had felt nothing. Whereas right now, looking at this crack, she felt afraid. Fear was not nothing. She tightened her helmet strap. Checked her headlamp. Took 3 slow breaths. She exhaled flat, pressed her shoulders together, and went in. The first 10 feet were manageable in the way that drowning's first 10 seconds are manageable, technically survivable, but every instinct screaming wrong direction. The limestone pressed her from all sides. Cold and indifferent. She moved on her elbows and her hip bones, turning her head sideways to fit her helmet through a particularly narrow section, tasting the particular smell of the deep earth, mineral, ancient. Utterly without comfort. She stopped at 15 feet. Her headlamp lit the passage ahead. It continued. Tight, but it continued. The crack made a slight left bend and she couldn't see past it. The ceiling scraped the back of her helmet. The floor pressed against her sternum. She had a sudden, involuntary image of Iris. Not the hospital, she'd spent 18 months trying not to see the hospital, but earlier. Iris at 4 years old, crawling under the kitchen table during hide-and-seek, certain that if she couldn't see Maya, Maya couldn't see her. The absolute confidence of a small person in a small space. "Mama, I found a cave," Iris had said, from under the table. Maya pressed her forehead against the limestone. She breathed. She moved forward. The bend at 15 feet was the worst of it. She had to rotate her body slightly, one shoulder dropping lower than the other, her pack dragging against the ceiling with a sound like tearing paper. For one long moment she was genuinely stuck, and the word stuck arrived in her mind with a weight she hadn't anticipated. Not panic. Something older than panic. Something cellular. She made herself go still. Stillness was the only answer in a tight passage. Force made it worse, and she knew this, and still her body wanted to thrash, wanted to push, wanted to do something. She breathed into the compression of the stone around her. She felt her ribs expand as far as they could, pressing against rock, then contract. "You are not stuck," she told herself. "You are slow." She moved her right shoulder down. Tilted her hips 2 inches left. Felt the stone release its grip by just enough. She came through the bend. Past the bend, the passage widened. Not dramatically, maybe to 22 inches, then 25. Enough to move more freely. She crawled faster, the headlamp throwing shadows that leapt and shifted, making the walls seem to breathe. At 25 feet, she stopped again. The floor dropped. Not far, 18 inches, maybe 2 feet, but a drop nonetheless. A breakdown room, she thought. Small, probably. She leaned over the edge with her headlamp and saw the floor below, covered in pale calcite flowstone. She eased herself down. She stood. She could stand. Full height. For the first time since entering the crack, she was fully upright, and the sensation was so unexpected that she actually gasped. She looked around. Small room. 10 feet across, perhaps. Ceiling maybe 6 feet high. The walls were covered in cave popcorn, that lumpy, cauliflower-like calcite formation, and in the corner, a small formation she recognized as a cave shield. A disc of calcium carbonate growing perpendicular to the wall, impossibly delicate, paper-thin at its edge. Nothing famous. Nothing that would make a guidebook. But real. Present. Solid in a way that the world above had stopped feeling. She sat down on the flowstone floor and stayed there for a while, just breathing. Then she noticed the passage on the far wall. Lower than the entrance. Much lower. 8 inches of clearance, maybe 10. A black gap at the base of the wall, exhaling cold air with a steadiness that meant somewhere beyond it, the cave continued. Air movement meant space. Potentially significant space. She measured it with her hand. 8 inches of vertical clearance. She would have to go in face first, completely flat, arms ahead of her like a diver, head turned sideways, body compressed to its absolute limit. She should not do this alone. She sat and looked at that gap for a very long time. She didn't go through that day. She went back through the crack, the bend was easier from this direction, somehow, and came out into the October afternoon blinking. Breathing the open air with a gratitude that felt almost physical. The old man's name was Harold. He made decent coffee and said almost nothing while she drank it, which she appreciated. When she was ready to leave, she asked if she could come back. "Gate's not locked," he said. "Never has been." She came back 6 more times over the next 3 weeks. Each time, she came better prepared. A thinner pack. A smaller light, mounted lower on her helmet. She did push-ups each morning, not for vanity but for functional strength, the kind that lets you hold your body rigid when the floor and ceiling are both your enemy. She lost a few more pounds she couldn't spare, then started eating more deliberately. Protein. Calories that mattered. She studied what she knew about cave formation in this part of Tennessee, the Mississippian limestone, the particular way water had carved these systems over millions of years. What those air currents likely meant about chamber geometry beyond the low gap. She became, slowly and almost without noticing it, interested. In something. In the mechanics of a problem. In the question of what lay past a gap she didn't yet know how to fit through. The curator of grief inside her noted this with suspicion. Interest felt like betrayal. Caring about anything felt like moving away from Daniel, from Iris, from the altar of their memory that she had been unconsciously tending. She sat with that feeling one night in her apartment above the laundromat and let herself feel it completely. The guilt. The complicated equation of a person who is still alive and occasionally, against their will, interested in something. Then she wrote in a notebook she hadn't touched in 2 years, "They would want me to want things." Iris especially. Iris wanted everything. On her 7th visit, she went through the low gap. The first 5 feet past the gap were the most frightening experience of her adult life. She was horizontal, completely horizontal, arms extended ahead of her, face turned sideways with her cheek against the stone. The ceiling was so close she could feel it with the tip of her helmet. She could not turn back quickly in this position, any retreat would be slow, deliberate, the same compressed crawl in reverse. She moved by pushing with her toes. By pulling with her fingertips. Inch by inch. This is how things are born, she thought, absurdly. This compression. This dark. The passage seemed to go on. And on. And then something changed. The ceiling lifted. She felt it before she saw it, the headlamp's throw changed, the shadows deepened differently, the sense of compression around her shoulders lessened. She moved faster. Her hands found empty air below and she realized the floor had dropped away, and she crawled to the edge of whatever she was on and looked down. She looked down for a long time. 40 feet below her, she would calculate it later, measuring the rope she dropped, the cave opened into something that had no business being here. A chamber. Not a room. A chamber. The ceiling arched above her head in a dome shape, 40 feet high at its peak, streaked with pale cream and rust-orange calcite, and hanging from it, thousands of them. Covering the dome's surface in a way that made it look like the ceiling was breathing, stalactites. Not the stubby, common kind. Long and glassy and perfectly formed, some of them touching the flowstone columns rising from the floor below to become pillars. Columns. Structures that had been growing, in complete and total darkness, for what the geology of them told her was at minimum 100,000 years. The walls were layered in cave coral and moon milk and formations she'd need time to identify. A small stream ran along the far edge of the chamber floor, black and perfectly clear and absolutely silent from this distance. And in the center of the chamber, lit now by her headlamp in a cone of yellow light that seemed insufficient, almost sacrilegious, was a helictite formation the size of a dining table, those bizarre, gravity-defying formations that grow in spirals and curves with no concern for physics, as if the cave simply couldn't stop being creative. She lay on the ledge at the top of the drop-in and she stared. She stared for a very long time. Later, she would struggle to describe what she felt in that moment. It wasn't joy, exactly, though joy was part of it. It wasn't peace, though the stillness of the chamber, that absolute, geological stillness, was the most peaceful thing she'd ever experienced. It was something more like recognition. As if some part of her that had been trying to say something for 18 months had finally found the right word. This existed, the cave seemed to say. All of this, in the dark, with no one watching. Growing anyway. For 100,000 years. Growing anyway. She put her face down against the stone. She cried. Not the grinding, airless grief she'd been living inside, something different. Something that felt like it had a floor. She cried until she was done, and then she looked at the chamber again. I'll come back, she said. Her voice vanished immediately, absorbed by the stone. I'll come back with people who need to see this. She had a lot to figure out. First and most immediately, she needed a rope rigged at the lip of that drop-in to access the chamber floor, which meant returning with vertical gear and ideally someone who knew what they were doing. Second, an undocumented chamber this size in Tennessee was a significant speleological discovery. She couldn't just bring friends. She needed to do this right. She called the Tennessee Cave Survey for the first time in 15 years. The woman who answered seemed surprised by the call, not because of its content but because of who it was. Maya Osei, she said. I used to read your field notes from the Sequatchie Valley system. That was a long time ago, Maya said. You coming back to caving? Maya looked at the notepad where she'd sketched the chamber from memory. The helictite formation in the center. The stalactite dome. The impossible scale of a thing that had been quietly, faithfully growing in the dark for longer than human civilization had existed. I found something, she said. I think it needs to be seen. The survey team she assembled was small, 3 people, including a vertical specialist named Jerome and a formation photographer named Sonny, who wept openly when she first entered the chamber and later claimed the photographs were the best of her career. They spent 2 weekends fully surveying and documenting the system. Harold, who turned out to have owned the property for 43 years, signed paperwork without hesitation and agreed to coordinate with the state for protection of the access. He told Maya, the second weekend, as they stood at the crack looking at the morning light on the limestone face, that his wife had gone into that crack 20 years ago and come out quiet. Like she'd seen something she couldn't talk about, and had refused to go back. She said it was too much, Harold said. Too much what? He thought about it. She didn't say. She just said too much. Maya understood this exactly. The chamber was officially registered with the National Speleological Society 4 months later. The survey named it formally, a technical name for the record, but in all the internal documentation, the photographs, the geological reports, it was referred to by the name Maya gave it on the day she found it. She called it Iris's Cathedral. Not for publication. Not for the geological record. Just for herself, and for Harold, who nodded slowly when she told him, like it was the only sensible name. She started teaching again that spring. Not at the university, that version of her life didn't fit anymore, not the same way. She taught a continuing education course through a local outdoor recreation center. Introduction to Caving and Cave Ecology. 6 students the first session. 14 the second. She wasn't performing recovery. She wasn't okay in the smooth, seamless way that grief counseling brochures suggested was the destination. She still had mornings that were very dark. She still sometimes sat in her apartment and felt the absence of Daniel's terrible coffee and Iris's orange things like a physical wound. But she was also, simultaneously and without contradiction, someone who could walk into a room and tell 14 people why cave formations matter, why the deep earth matters. Why the fact that things grow in complete darkness, slowly, incrementally, without any audience or acknowledgement, is one of the most important things she's ever understood. She started eating properly. Not as a project, not as self-improvement, but because she started being hungry again. Interested in meals. Present enough at dinner to have preferences. Her sister visited from Atlanta and cried a little when she saw Maya looking like someone who lived inside her own body again. "You went underground to come back up," her sister said. "That's the most therapist thing you've ever said," Maya told her. "I've had a lot of therapy," her sister said. Some of it worked. She returned to Iris's Cathedral twice more in those months. Once with Jerome, to extend the survey to the stream passage at the far end. It connected, they discovered, to a separate cave system 2 hills away. Creating a hydrological link that the State Geological Survey found significant enough to warrant a research paper Maya was asked to co-author. And once alone. She went alone on an afternoon in June, descended the rope into the chamber with smooth efficiency, her body having relearned what it knew. And sat on the flowstone floor in the center of the room with her headlamp off. Total darkness. Total silence. In darkness that complete, your other senses don't exactly sharpen, it's more that the noise of vision disappears, and suddenly there is only the cold air on your skin. The smell of minerals and ancient water, the small sound of the stream at the chamber's edge, and your own heartbeat, which is louder than you expect it to be. Louder and more persistent. More insistent about its own continuing. She sat there for a long time. Above her, in the dome of the ceiling, 10,000 stalactites were doing what they had always done, growing. One drop at a time. One mineral deposit at a time. In the dark. Without urgency. Without awareness that anyone would ever come to see them. Growing anyway. The geological report came out in the winter, and with it, a modest amount of attention. Not viral, not the kind of thing that trends, but meaningful within the community. A paragraph in a regional magazine. An invitation to speak at a speleological conference in Chattanooga, which Maya accepted with real nervousness and delivered with imperfect but genuine presence. After the talk, a young woman approached her. 20s. Red-rimmed eyes that Maya recognized not as recent crying but as the steady state of someone in long grief. She said she'd read about the discovery. She said she'd grown up in Belhaven. She said she'd passed that limestone face her whole childhood and never known anything was behind it. "How did you know to go in?" the woman asked. "When it looked like nothing from the outside?" Maya thought about this. She thought about Harold pointing at a hillside. About a padlocked gate and a folding chair and an old man's patience. About a crack 17 inches wide and the particular quality of fear that is not nothing. "I didn't know," she said. "I just didn't have a good reason not to." The young woman nodded slowly, the way people nod when a thing lands somewhere deeper than the words themselves. "The cave was always there," Maya said. "That's the part that got me. Everything inside it, every formation, every column, every 100,000-year-old stalactite, it was all there the whole time. Growing in the dark. Not because anyone was watching. Just because that's what water and time and minerals do when you give them enough space." She paused. Nobody had to discover it for it to be real. The young woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is it open to visitors?" "Not yet," Maya said. "We're still figuring out how to protect it. But someday." She meant it. She was already in conversations with Harold and the state about a management plan, very limited access, guided only, no formations touched. She wanted people to see it. Not many, and not carelessly, but people. She believed that. But the thing that changed Maya most profoundly was not the discovery. It was something she realized slowly, over months, and didn't have language for until she was sitting in her apartment one evening grading her students' cave ecology journals, small, earnest notebooks full of sketched cross-sections and questions about hydrology, and she felt it crystallize. The cave had been there for millions of years. The crack had been 17 inches wide for as long as the hillside had existed. Harold's wife had gone in 20 years ago and come out quiet and gone no further. And the cathedral, Arisa's cathedral, with its dome and its pillars and its impossible helictite growing sideways against all logic, for no reason except that it could, had been waiting. Not for Maya specifically. It hadn't been waiting for anyone. It was simply there, growing, in its own time, on its own terms. The world was full of things like that. Maya understood this now with a certainty that felt geological, slow to form but permanent. Full of things that existed before you arrived and would exist after you left. Cathedrals in the dark. Beauty without audience. Growth without permission. You could be in so much pain that you drove 2 hours to feel something, anything, and found a padlocked gate. And you could turn around on that road and meet a patient old man on a folding chair who pointed at a hillside. And the hillside could contain 17 inches of terrifying passage, and on the other side of those 17 inches could be 100,000 years of quiet, faithful, undiscovered wonder. Or it couldn't. That was the other possibility, always. You could go through a crack in the earth and find only more rock. But you'd never know from the outside. You had to go in. Maya Osei still caves. Still teaches. Still has difficult mornings and a one-room apartment above a laundromat, though she's thinking about moving now, thinking about a place with a porch, maybe. Something with a tree in the yard. She still carries Iris and Daniel the way you carry things that have become part of your structure, not weight, exactly, not anymore. More like the calcium in your bones. Invisible in daily motion, but foundational. Present in everything you do without announcing itself. Harold died the following February, quietly and apparently without suffering, at home, which was the way he would have wanted it. He left the property to a land trust that Maya helped establish, ensuring the cave's protection in perpetuity. In his desk, his daughter found a handwritten note addressed to no one in particular that said only, "My wife was right." It was too much. But too much is not the same as too bad. Maya keeps this note on her desk, next to a small piece of flowstone Harold had given her from the fields above the cave, not from the cave itself. She would never take a formation, just a piece of surface limestone, gray and unremarkable. Nothing to look at. Which is, of course, the point. Here is what a crack in the earth taught a woman who had stopped believing in interiors, that the most significant things often have the most ordinary entrances. That compression is not the same as ending. That the capacity to grow does not require light or audience or acknowledgement or even hope, only time, and the slow accumulation of whatever you have to offer. And that sometimes the only reason to go into a dark and narrow place is that you are afraid, and fear is not nothing, and being alive means being unfinished. And being unfinished means there are still passages ahead that you haven't measured yet. 40 feet in, she found a cathedral. She had to become small enough to find it. So here is the question this story leaves with you: what have you decided is too narrow to enter, and what might be growing on the other side of it, in the dark, waiting not for you specifically, but available to you completely, if you are willing to exhale, and compress, and move forward anyway?